All right. Hello from the basement in Arlington. But with One More Page Books. Happy that everybody is tuning in this evening. I'm just going to give people a second to get logged in. And then I'm going to introduce our guest tonight. I'm just going to give people a second to get logged in. Hearing myself because I had the browser open. Sorry about that. So we know we're live. So I'm going to do a quick introduction of our guest tonight. We have a nice little video to show you, and then we'll get started with the conversation. So welcome to virtual One More Page Books. We have Jess Walter with us tonight, celebrating the release of his new novel, The Cold Millions, and as well as local author Kathleen McCleary. Let me do a little introduction of both of them. Jess Walter began his writing career as a reporter at the Spokesman Review, has worked as a screenwriter and taught graduate creative writing at several universities. His last novel, Beautiful Ruins, was a #1 New York Times bestseller and spent more than a year on the bestseller list. And it was one of my personal favorites, so that's one of the reasons I'm very excited for tonight's conversation. He lives in Spokane, Washington, which is where most of the new novel, The Cold Millions, is set, though it's in quite a different Spokane. I'm excited for you to talk about The Cold Millions tonight. I was very excited I got to read it in advance, and I will say I'm agreeing with some of the comparisons and the reviews about the Steinbeck comparisons. I felt the same way. And to get the conversation going, I want to introduce our other author joining us tonight. Kathleen McCleary is a journalist and author here in Virginia who's written 3 novels, including Leaving Haven. Her nonfiction writing has appeared in the New York Times, the Washington Post, Parade, and other publications, and she also teaches writing. So we thought having the journalism, novel writing, and writing teacher background, this would be a very good and engaging conversation for everybody. So let me switch over to a video for a second.
I've ventured far away to New York and the Zero, Italy and Hollywood and beautiful ruins, but I always find myself coming back to Spokane. They woke on a ball field. Bums, tramps, hobos, stiffs. They floated in from mines and farms and log camps, filled every flop and boarding house, slept in parks and alleys. And on the night just past, this abandoned ball field. My new novel, The Cold Millions, begins here, Peaceful Valley, Spokane, Washington, 1909. The book mixes fiction and history in a way that's almost impressionistic, blending past events with present concerns. I hope you enjoy The Cold Millions.
So Kathleen and I have enjoyed The Cold Millions. One quick housekeeping note before I turn it over to you guys is for those of you joining online, you can comment and ask questions on YouTube using the chat function on YouTube. We will get to questions towards the end of the hour, but feel free to pop those in as they come into your mind. So we'll get to as many as we can. And now I'll turn things over to Kathleen and Jess.
All right. Well, thanks very much. Before I got started talking to Jess and asking questions, I just wanted to let all of you who've bought the book know what a treat you're in for. The reviews for the book so far are amazing, and I can tell you from reading it, it is amazing. You're really going to have fun. But I just wanted you to hear what some others had said about it. Publishers Weekly said, "The Sum is a splendid postmodern rendition of the social realist novels of the 1930s by Henry Roth, John Steinbeck, and John Dos Passos, updated with strong female characters and executed with pristine prose. This could well be Walter's best work yet." And the Wall Street Journal said, "He's written across genres for decades, publishing a novel consistently every few years to produce a body of work that is cohered into that of a regional novelist, then an American novelist, and now a global force." So that's pretty high praise, and it's well deserved. So the first thing I want to talk about is asking you, when we write about a place we know intimately, and you've lived in Spokane your entire life, it can't help but be autobiographical because we're such a part of the places we love or that have shaped us. So I'm just wondering if this is your most kind of personal or autobiographical novel.
Yeah, it's funny to hear yourself called a global force while you're, you've just spent the day picking up tree branches in the backyard and, in your home. Feel very much like a local force today. But I'm glad you used that word personal because I don't think of myself as writing autobiographical fiction very often. I'm not a hobo. I didn't live in 1909. I have very little in common with the other characters, but it's definitely very personal. I come from a working class family. Both of my grandfathers were itinerant workers, a generation later in the 1930s. But one of my grandfathers was killed when a crane fell on him on a work site, on a road crew. The other one was a rancher his whole life. And growing up, he would tell me these stories about hopping trains in the Dakotas, and that's how he first arrived in Spokane, in the place I live now. His name was also Jess Walter, and there was a sense of this adventure to hopping a train. At the time, my favorite book was Treasure Island, and hopping a train sounded so much like stowing away on a pirate ship that I think the two things always kind of connected. My dad worked for 35 years at an aluminum plant, and not to give too much away, but the novel almost ends at the place I come into the world, at the height of labor Democrats and aluminum plants, and a kind of life that I think has left. So I do think it's very personal, and the sense of place for me is very personal too. I'm a big fan of Southern writers, but I think sometimes writers in other regions think that the South is the only place where setting can rise to the level of character and language. And I think, having spent my life in the Northwest, that the Northwest is one of the most unique places. And the literature of this place, I think, also owes very much to the kind of atmospheric and economic history of this place.
Oh, for sure. I mean, Ken Kesey is a Northwest.
Yeah, he's a great example. Yeah. Sometimes a great notion. You can just smell the chainsaws and trees in that novel. Yeah.
Yeah, that's a good example. Well, so that brings me to this story has some real life historical figures in it, like Elizabeth Gurley Flynn, the labor organizer, and John Sullivan, the police chief, and even the lawyer Fred Moore. And so you weave these real life people together with completely fictional characters. And I was wondering, well, two things. One, how you researched these historical figures, and then how hard it was to fictionalize them when you're a reporter and you've done actual research and know all the facts.
Yeah, it's such a good question. I did envision at one time, I thought maybe this will be another nonfiction book. My first book was nonfiction. And when I came across the free speech riots of 1909, which is sort of the center of the novel, and especially Elizabeth Gurley Flynn, it was during the last 4 years, and thinking about resistance and about protest and about the effectiveness of those things. And so I did for a while think maybe this should be a nonfiction book. But my research was, reading as many books as I could, Gurley Flynn's autobiography, biographies of her. But I would say the most fruitful research, honestly, was old newspapers. In 1909, newspapers were Google. They were everything. They had, and Spokane, a city at the time of 100 and some thousand, had 4 daily newspapers, newsboys out on the street hawking them at all times, updated during the day like the internet. And so I think if it's possible, I got a sunburn from microfilm. I spent so much time at the library just hunched over and reading these old newspapers. And we tend to think that, the partisanship and the balkanization of media that we have now. You choose Fox or you choose MSNBC. We think of that as new, but to read newspapers in 1909 is to read the establishment newspaper, the labor newspaper, the populist newspaper. And I would sort of triangulate these events by reading the four of them. There's a certain freedom in researching as a novelist, as you know, Kathleen. You're not necessarily looking at what happened, but what could have happened. And I always have to remind myself of that. I joke that I have to fire the research department after about a year and turn it over to the fiction department when I'm writing fiction. But the freedom you get from knowing a world that well. And some of your research is just, how much does a pair of gloves cost? What's playing at the theaters? And when you're conversant in a time and a place, then it's time to fire the research department. And for me, I still felt a real fidelity toward those real characters.
Yeah.
Elizabeth Gurley Flynn's story is so great, it doesn't need the embellishment of fiction. So while I created these fictional characters alongside her, most of her speeches, most of the things that I have her say in the novel come from things she said. When the newspaper writes about her, I quote the articles that the newspaper wrote about her. A 19-year-old pregnant labor activist, going west to organize workers 10 years before she even has the right to vote, didn't need a whole lot of fictionalizing.
Yeah, I bet. And she is just an incredible character.
Yeah, it's funny. I'd never written anything that was like a Western, and this felt like an archetypal Western, like Deadwood, the idea of civilization degrading the environment and native tribes at the same time that violence sort of births a city. And this felt very much like it had these Western themes. And I was well into my research when I thought, if this is a Western and it's one of those stranger rides into town stories, my Clint Eastwood is a 19-year-old pregnant labor activist. And having her be, even though she's not the protagonist of the novel, having that sort of heroic figure at the heart of it was, I don't know, it felt like one of those gifts you give yourself as a storyteller.
Well, and there is kind of a Wild West feel to it. There's kind of violence can erupt at any moment. Human life is very cheap. There's lawlessness. And there's some wild, larger than life figures in it too.
And much of which also really happened. When I was doing my research and I realized that 3 days before the free speech riots, a police officer had been killed, and then another one at the end. It sort of really framed the story for me. And again, to be able to, to create a story that I feel like could wind in and out of the actual facts is for me, kind of a fun thing to do. But it definitely was the city was moving from really a rough Western frontier town full of brothels and saloons to a much more modern place. And I get really inspired by postcards. And there was an old postcard I had that showed this crowded, packed city streetcars full with horses and automobiles on the street at the same time. And I really just wanted to write about this melding of times, so I think it does have a feel of a Western still.
Yeah,
yeah.
And that said, there's some you write these intriguing different point of views in the novel. That's one thing I loved, is you kind of have the third person where you're seeing things through Ryan's eyes, but then there's all these characters and other voices who come in. My favorite was Ursula the Great. I absolutely loved her character. I loved her voice and the way she was written. And I was wondering if there was one that flowed the most easily for you.
Thank you for that. That was much of what I do as a writer is just to entertain myself, honestly. And yet I always, for this novel especially, because I was writing about a time that in many ways is so different, even though there are these echoes of the same politics we're living in now, the same economic issues. I wanted to not just have the depth of that fiction can give you with character, but a kind of breadth. I wanted to bring the whole world in. I had this image of the novel. The motif of the novel is kind of the Spokane River, this big raging Pacific River that flows through my city. And I had this idea of these other characters coming in as undercurrents or tributaries. And so landing on a character like Ursula the Great, you know, who sort of announces herself by saying a woman owns nothing in this world except her memories, and it's a terrible return on investment. And when you have a character who just sort of, it's almost like they walk in and announce, you know, I'm here. Where's my, you know, what can I do? So she had already been a character in the novel. When I sat down to write her scene. She's also one of my favorites. Another Del Dalvo, an aging Pinkerton detective. And in both cases, the voices of the characters are so strong that, you know, the fun part for me is writing them. You know, I get to, it's almost like I could imagine, I'm not an actor, but I could imagine it's like getting a great part as a character actor, you know, as a smaller part that kind of steals the show, and getting to write those bits was like that for me.
Well, and they do have very unique voices. You know, they really sound like themselves and nobody else, which is one of the things that makes them so believable and makes it so much fun to read.
Yeah, when Ursula, you know, tells the story of her sister saying that, you know, that she has a weakness for beauty in men, and that her sister says she has a man's lecherous eye and that it's going to lead to her ruin. You'll be writing something like that, and then it's almost as, you know, it's that kind of mumbo jumbo that fiction writers talk about, that their characters speak. But when she says, you know, then let's get on with it, you know, it almost feels like, you know, something you didn't know about the character before you wrote it. And so, yeah, I really loved her voice. Del, it was interesting because I was writing about this in-between period, and because Pinkerton detectives were so engaged at the time in the labor wars and the class wars of the early 1900s, I again bury myself into research, and realizing that James McParlin, probably the most famous Pinkerton detective, was from Scotland. I started looking at sort of late 19th century language, and again, Del arrives on the scene by saying Spokane gives him the morbs. Spokane gives him the morbs. And coming across a phrase like that has gone out of use, you know, a feeling of unease, feeling of morbidity, you know, feeling that something morbid is about to happen, feels like this, again, like this gift you've stumbled across. And so Del's language felt to me like, you know, if this is crossing out of the time of horses into automobiles, it's also crossing out of the Western into noir. And he felt like a sort of proto-noir detective character. And so to be able to write that language with this combination of sort of a dusty Western mixed in with you know, these Britishisms that had gone out of fashion was, again, it becomes an entertaining thing to write. That's a, you know, fun day at the keyboard.
Well, and it comes across that way because his character isn't entirely sympathetic. He's certainly, but he's intriguing to read and very authentic.
Yeah, he's not very sympathetic. My first hero as a novelist was Kurt Vonnegut, and his old advice, which I think was half facetious, was to throw away the first chapter and put a villain in it. And I love that he gave that advice without ever reading it. But I've yet to read a book that probably wouldn't be improved, my own included. You know, by probably the first chapter and put a villain in it. Yeah.
Is there? You did research in writing this book, but also, as you just said, you wrote these different voices. Was there anything really unexpected that happened in the process of writing this book for you?
For me, it's always unexpected. I don't set out with much of a plan. I'm a huge outliner, but only when I've got about 8 pages left in the book. And then I have to sort of chart and see what I've done. Beautiful Ruins was that way and is similarly told in different voices. Mm-hmm. And in both cases, I sort of work my way intuitively into corners and then have to, figure out what it means. So there were so many surprises along the way. I think the one that lands with me the most, though, I started this book thinking I wanted to write about the last, the end of the Gilded Age and income inequality. And being a working class writer, it's never very far from my mind, living in a working class city. And so I wanted to write about these characters in a way and write about income inequality that isn't didactic. I wanted to embed it in narrative and story. And so I knew I was writing about a time that would resemble our own because I chose it for that reason. But to be writing about social unrest and about protests and about activism, the summer of the protests involving Black Lives Matter was, I think the echoes of today, I think, surprised me as I was working through it. I just kept seeing these things that resonated in the moment that we were in now.
Well, and that actually directly leads to one of my questions. I wondered when you started writing this novel because it feels so timely.
Yeah.
With a lot of things, it deals with protests that erupt into violence, police brutality, wealth inequality, a justice system that targets the poor, a very polarized political mood, and even kind of a ravaged ecosystem.
Yeah. And
so you said some of that was in your mind, but when did you actually start the novel?
That's always such a hard question for me. I don't know how you were, Kathleen, but for me, I always think of myself as a magpie. So I'm flying around getting little bits of garbage and bringing them back to my office. And when I was a newspaper reporter in the 1990s, I was doing research into the free speech riots in Spokane because it just fascinated me. And it fascinated me that it was a piece of history that I'd never heard of. But so I put it in a file. I have 16 files on my computer, possible novel ideas. But I really jumped into it probably in around 2010, in one of those times when I was stuck on Beautiful Ruins. I wrote a few pages of these two young men, and then I set it aside and picked it up again in about 2014, I suppose. And then I wrote myself into a corner and dropped it and picked up another novel and worked on it for a while. And it's kind of the way I've always worked when I just write until I'm stuck, and then I usually move on and write a short story or jump into another novel. So I have another novel that I've got about a third of the way through and got stuck on that, and then came back to The Cold Millions. And when I came back to it, I can always tell when I mean business and when the story has me so gripped. I think and dream in that story, and you feel this momentum pushing you on. So. But it was about 2014 or 15 when I jumped into it. And then after the election of 2016, the question of activism, I was at science marches and, marches for all sorts of things over the last few years. So I was thinking about activism. And one of the things that I loved about the story, watching the way young people the last few years, whether it's the activists at Parkland High School asking for reasonable gun laws, or if it's those children protesting climate change by walking out of school, or the Black Lives Matter protests, watching the way young people, their idealism bubbles up, and then to be working on a novel about a 19-year-old heroine and characters who are 16 and 23. I very much, felt as I was writing it that's what I wanted to do, is write about idealism and activism, and but again, not in a didactic way, but in a way that was pegged to this different moment.
Well, and it's one of my favorite lines was Ryan asks Flynn late in the book, how do you keep fighting when injustice seems to win?
Yeah.
So you're kind of saying that having these young protagonists out there is the answer.
Well, I think it is, and it's interesting because the Elizabeth Gurley Flynn goes on to help found the ACLU and become the chairwoman of the Communist Party USA, and so and she did win the battle in Spokane, but the IWW, the organization she was in, was outlawed within a few years. But if you look at the world that Rye grows into in the 1960s, much of what they fought for in that labor movement was gained. And so I do think that they're the leading edge of a revolution is not always the success that we measure, but advancement, the progress in a civilization happens in part because of the activism and the idealism of youth. A lot of us, I think, drift away from that idealism. We begin to believe things are politically impossible, or that it's too hard, and so I think the value of that, and it was a question I found myself wanted to ask Elizabeth Gurley Flynn by the end.
Yeah.
How do you go on? How do you keep fighting when it seems like we don't win? And it's one of the few times when I had to invent a response from her. I didn't find it in her autobiography or any of the news stories. I had to imagine what she might have said to Rye in that moment.
Yeah, well, it's certainly a good question for our times.
Yeah. Sadly, it is. Yeah.
And so I want to take a moment here and just quote a couple of my favorite sentences from the novel, because they're in part related to what we're talking about here. One of my favorites was this one. And lying there, Rye had an insight that felt like a reverie, that man or woman, Catholic or prod, Chinese, Irish or African, Finn or Indian, rich or poor poor, the world is built to eat you alive. But before you go down the gullet, the bastards can't stop you from looking around. And I love that sentence. I mean, it just does convey, he's so young, and it conveys kind of this enthusiasm he has to soak up all these experiences at the same time that many of them are terrifying and disheartening and frightening.
And it was one of the inspiring things for me about the industrial workers of the world is they accepted all of the people that he just talked about. Most unions at the time would take white men. That was it. And so, and often only men from, only Irish men or only, Italian men, if that was. And so a union that didn't exclude, but that included people. Rye's idealism does come from youth, and but it also comes from a boy waking up on a fall day outside, having slept outside with his brother, and you asked about the personal things in the book, and I dedicated the book to my dad, who was a lifelong union man. And in my family, we didn't go to church on Sundays. Our religion, our sense of fairness came from the idea that you pulled everybody up. My dad, that's what, fairness came from that. I remember as a kid, someone using a racial epithet in our front yard, and my dad burst out of the house, grabbed him by the scruff, and said, "We don't talk that way in this house." And that lesson was so profound at the time. That lesson that everyone's the same, we're all fair. And then the other person I dedicated to was my brother, because Gig and Rye's relationship, while not like my brother and me, I'm older, and neither one of us has Gig's charm, I'm afraid. My brother very much we have that relationship where responsibility and love kind of swirl around each other, where, Gig and Rye have to take care of each other as much as they get to enjoy each other's company. So yeah, I think Rye waking up on that ball field and having that moment, that epiphany the night after having his first beers with the union guys was, it just felt like the place to start his story.
Yeah, and I really liked that. Now, another thing that was interesting to me is you end several of the different points of view with death scenes. You go where most people don't want to go by imagining what happens in the moments before you die, what you're thinking about, what it feels like. So I'm intrigued to hear a little bit about what was behind that, because it happens to more than one character.
Yeah. The first impulse was that I'd never read it before. I thought, why have I never, I have not seen this. And when I realized that there was going to be a level of violence in the book, I didn't want to cut away from it. You know, I wanted to see it. I wanted to feel it. It's funny to write a book set in 1909, because at one point you realize all these people are gone. They're all ghosts. They don't exist anymore. And that was so, I mean, it's an obvious thing, but as many obvious things are, it felt strangely profound to me. And writing those scenes was, you know, it's sort of intimate to write a character, I think. You know, to write someone like Ursula the Great, you feel intimacy with them. And, you know, having nursed my mom at the end, and there's nothing more intimate than that moment. And so, you know, even though the deaths in the book are, many of them are sort of violent or sudden, there was still a sense of intimacy that made me feel like it's one of those things fiction can deliver that other things can't. You know, and because the story was launched in many ways by, you know, the deaths of a couple of characters, that it seemed to me like, you know, something that, again, on those days when I'm writing and trying to keep myself entertained, it seemed like something I wanted to try.
Well, you handle it very well, but it's kind of like, it's very compelling to read, but the affection for the characters comes through in most of it. Because with all of the characters, even the ones who are unsavory or not somebody you'd want to know, there's a tenderness there for just their human foibles. And I think that comes across even in how you handle some of these deaths. That was something I really resonated with me.
You might have found my weakness as a poker player and read off. So, yeah.
Yeah, so I just thought that was delightful.
Thank you.
Another question I had is, the title comes from one of my favorite scenes in the book, because you describe it so brilliantly, and because Ryan's emotions feel so vivid and real. And it's when Ryan walks into this mansion and is exposed to just an unimaginable level of luxury and extravagance that he really had not even been able to think existed before. And so, is it giving away too much if I read the sentence that says where the title comes from? All people except this rich cream, living and scraping and fighting and dying. And for what? Nothing. The cold millions with no chance in this world. And so Ryan kind of recognizes he's one of the cold millions. And so I had two questions about this. One, was that just the instinctive title for you? Did you always know that? Did you come?
No, in fact, the book for a while had the title of another line in the novel. Another transient says to Rye, "Yeah, you better get off before Spokane. There's nothing west of dead." And back when it was more Western, I guess, and not the Steinbeckian class novel that it is now, I thought that might be the title. But you asked about things that surprise you, and it is great when characters surprise you. And a couple things about Rye: he's a clothes horse of all things. You know, he longs for a good pair of gloves and a nice suit, and he really appreciates the trappings of this place. You know, and yet there is this moment. I think he knows that several layers of wealth separate someone like him and Lembrand. Of course he knows that. But to be in that room, to be in a room with a heated floor, drinking brandy, surrounded by floor-to-ceiling, two-story books in a library, none of the books of which have been cracked. They're just there to make Lembrand look intelligent. Rye has the realization that it's not 7 or 8 or 10 layers. It's hundreds, thousands. It's an infinite number of layers, and it breaks his heart. It breaks his heart for not just for himself, but in empathy for others. And I love that it happens in a library too, because being a working class kid, books were my social escalator. That was the way, and being a bit of an autodidact like Gig. I loved the fact that Gig is reading War and Peace and has only read 40% of it, but can already say that it's the greatest work of literature in the world. And I love that he collects the books on the Great Hobo Library. You pull one out of your pack and you trade with what someone else has, and that these are the things he clings to. So as Rye is sitting in this luxurious library. To me, that's when the novel really came into focus. You don't always know what you're writing until you get a scene like that. And then, you realize that Rye's ambition, to go back to your words, personal, that the place that he feels it is a place you would feel it. And that the pain he feels for the fact that our culture is so unfair, that there's nothing egalitarian, that that the dream he had on that ball field, that that he's got the same view as a wealthy San Francisco mining magnate. I think it breaks his heart a little, and that's what really launches him as a character in the novel.
And just another question on that scene is that room was so exquisitely described, as you say. I had to know, was that based on a place you've actually been, or that's completely out of your?
No, there are a couple of old mansions in Spokane that I would steal some tile from, or I had a friend who was in San Francisco, and she told me that someone told her orchids were the hardest flowers to get. So I would pick up little details like that. But no, it was an imagined. There are some grand houses in Spokane. We showed that short video, but there's a longer version if you get a chance to watch it. That in which I walked through some of the those early 20th century neighborhoods where some of these grand houses were built. But no, it's just the place I imagined that Lem would live, and that Rye would have this epiphany.
Oh, that's great. And so I have a question here actually from another writer who's attending tonight, Sarah McCoy. And she wants to know, she'd like to hear you talk about the women characters. Given that your protagonists are men, what empowering qualities do you bestow women, and why are those significant to the men and the greater narrative?
Well, it's kind of tricky to write about 1909. Because whatever empowering qualities women would have, they would bring to the table themselves. They wouldn't, Elizabeth Gurley Flynn is unable to own property by herself. She, unless her husband signs off on it, and I think the choice of her as one of the two women in the story was, in a way, created that for me. And really, it was through research. When I was reading her a biography of her and then her autobiography, she really her mother Anne comes across as just this powerful figure. She found the only female doctor in New York to deliver her children. She raised them with this fiery sense that they must fight for everything they want out of the world, and so. And yet, when her daughter comes to her at 15 and says, "I'm going west to, fight for, to fight as a labor activist," often, I don't know about you, but I'll be writing and I'll be thinking I'm writing from one point of view, and then I'll all of a sudden find myself embodying the other one, and imagining being that parent who's raised their daughter to challenge, a patriarchy that is so much more rigid than anything that we live in now. And then at 15, she says she's leaving to go out to become a labor activist. I just imagine what that would be like for both of them. And it was, that the courage that would take. It was hard for me to imagine someone like Gurley Flynn now, let alone in 1909. With Ursula the Great, who's the other major female character in the story, I wanted someone who had to deal with a very different kind of political and economic truth. And she's much more of a pragmatist, much more hardened, and also, more, I think, sly about what she wants and how she's going to go about getting it. Probably my favorite scene in the novel, not to give anything away, but Rye has come into some money and he goes around and is giving every character, and they all take it. And I love that she doesn't take the money. It just felt to me like, again, like something you didn't know about the character until you got there. That despite the fact that she has to make far more compromises than Gurley Flynn, who is driven entirely by her righteousness. That Ursula the Great too has a kind of pride and a kind of sense of herself that that you don't know, that I didn't see at first.
Well, both of the female characters are really strong characters. They're some of the strongest characters in the novel, actually. And Ursula is almost a
yeah. What's that?
Well, Ursula is almost like a touchstone in the novel, like a hero in some ways, because as you say, she gets everything she does on her own. She has great empathy and helps out other characters.
And she performs on a stage with a live cougar, where I feel like her CV is a little incomplete if we don't start there.
She performs on stage in a cage with a live cougar.
Starts outside the cage. She sings and dances, and it's one of those great research moments. I was just embedded in Spokane in 1909 was the best theater town other than San Francisco in the West. It had the largest theater stage, which people keep telling one of the characters until he can't take the boosters anymore, in the world. And it had just all of these great theaters. So when I was doing this research and I was in the library, and I would have my notebook open and I would copy microfilm pages, but I'd also jot down notes. And I remember the next day looking and seeing Ursula the Great sings and dances with a live cougar. And I couldn't remember if I'd invented that or if I actually found it. So I had to go back to the library and do another full search. And apparently I invented it. But then I thought, well, how would that work? And it's one of those aha genius moments when you think they sew meat into the corset. So she turns back to the audience, takes off the corset, and throws it to the cat, who's been growling because that's what he's trained to do. And there are moments like that as a fiction writer that you really expect the Nobel Prize committee to just call from Stockholm before you've even finished the sentence.
Good if you're having those.
Yeah.
It's great if you're having those. Those are just, as I said, those were some of my favorite characters.
And, thank you for the question, Sarah.
I had a couple more questions. I read a quote once where you once said, writing is a lot like playing the piano. Some people get to play classical masterpieces. Others end up playing at juke joints. And I wondered if would you describe this book as one or the other?
When I've said that initially, I've meant journalism. I always thought of my journalism career as, sit at this piano, we'll put assignments in this glass, and I'd be like, this piano hasn't been tuned, shut up, here's another assignment, and I don't know this song, well, you better play it anyway. And I loved that about journalism. I loved that it forced, you can't wait for the muse to strike. You can't go and say, well, it was, a house fire, but I just wasn't feeling it. You had to write. And so I do think of novels as, the piano's got to be tuned for me to be able to write a novel. And it has less to do with the subject or the topic or the genre as the sort of level of engagement. But I will forever think of writing as play. I think it's one of the things that causes writer's block, is we call it work. No musician ever says, sits down, grabs a guitar and says, I better work, play. And, for me, there's a real joy in, coming up with something like meat sewn in a corset that feels very much like play. And the sound of the sentences, I'm not musical at all, as my family will tell you, but I think musically about writing, about the sentences, about the flow and the way they should sound. And so,
because another of my favorite sentences I'll throw in here, because it's a playful one, was Ursula talking about Lem Brand takes her out to dinner for the first time.
Yeah.
And she says, we were served a French red wine, a fine local beefsteak, scallops from Seattle, and gnocchi that might have been pinched from the ass of an Italian angel. And I love that line and that image. It's true to the character, but it also, as you say, it's play. I mean, you must have had fun writing that sentence.
Yeah, and again, I think you can have that fun when you're writing sometimes those minor characters and letting their voices go, and the funny thing about that is a line like that manages to be both a little dismissive, but also you're like, man, I'll bet that's good gnocchi.
Exactly. Exactly. Well, I had a couple questions too about your writing process, but I thought I'd also just ask them the way Maureen Dowd does, is confirm or deny. I've read many things about your writing process and was hoping you could just confirm them or deny them for me.
I'll try. Yeah.
One, you write 365 days a year.
Deny. I took Christmas off last year, but I write almost every day. Yeah.
So you took one day off the whole year?
I mean, it's play. There's a guitar sitting there. What I call work, I don't know if you can see that chair back there, but I will grab a book and nap. I'll come out here at 5 in the morning, and then, often I've only written 7 sentences. But yeah, it's my favorite thing to do. We go on vacation so I can write. So.
Oh, that's great. All right, here's another one. You usually have 3 books going at once, so if you get stuck on one, you can move on to another.
Like I said, when I get focused on the end, in the last year and a half, that's not the case. But yeah, I usually I write across genres and across styles, and I used to call starting a book getting the taste of that last one out of my mouth. I wanted to do something very different on the page, and it was a way, coming from journalism, I did not want to have writer's block. I wanted to keep going, and so it was a way, when I got stuck, I would just jump into something else. I had, in 2005, I had a novel come out, Citizen Vince, which won the Edgar Award, and then 2006, The Zero came out, which was a National Book Award finalist, and it made other writers think that I was, so incredibly productive, because it looked like, 1 year after a year after the last novel. But the truth was, I'd been working on them both for years, and it just sometimes takes me a while to finish. And Beautiful Ruins was different for me in a way, because I started in 1997 before I'd published anything, and wrote a couple of drafts before it came out in 2012. And I began to not only trust the time it takes, but to think it's kind of vital. It's kind of key to what we're doing. I didn't, the person who started that novel could not have finished it. The person who could finish it was 15 years later. So yeah, a long confirmation. Yes, I work on, but sometimes it's short stories. I've written movie scripts. Sometimes it's a book review, but I am always writing 2 or 3 things at once.
That really impresses many of the writers I know. They who find it difficult to work on more than one thing.
I feel like dishearten them and drive them out of the business is what I would. No, it's totally out of necessity. Just, I was so afraid someone was going to make me go back to my newspaper job that when I got stuck, I would just start something new.
That's interesting. All right, here's another one. You read as many as 4 books a week?
Boy, not anymore. I will deny that. Yeah, if I get through a book a week now, for a while I was a much more voracious reader. I really do connect with Gig's sense of being an autodidact and being self-educated. And when I started out, especially, with the sort of marginal education I had, I felt like I was reading in a frenzy. And if someone would mention an author, I would chuckle like I knew exactly their work and go to the library the next morning. And, I need Stendhal, as much Stendhal as you have, just in case I found myself in another conversation. So I think I read with the sort of ferocity that the self-taught sometimes have, all the way through about my 40s. I think I'm a more discerning reader now, and I need about 5 hours a day to check 538.com, and so that really cuts into your reading time.
Well, hopefully that'll shift.
I'm hoping to get back to reading at least 2 books a week. Yeah.
Well, because many authors I know can't read when they're writing because they don't want another voice in their head, or even unconsciously the rhythm of another author's voice.
Yeah, I'm always baffled by that, just because to me there's I've never had a period where I wasn't reading. I go through periods. When the pandemic first started, I was gobbling up books, and then maybe book promotion. I'm not sure what slowed me down a little bit, but I am careful about not reading in the same arena that I'm writing in. I made the mistake of rereading Ragtime by E.L. Doctorow when I was working on this novel, which is unbelievable and takes place in the same time period. And it really did break my heart for a few weeks that I was not going to be able to write something that brilliant.
Oh, well, that's interesting. So that's a smart thing to think about.
Yeah, but most people are not writing in the particular time period and and genre that I'm writing in then, and so many great books come out, and I think I used to feel pressure on both ends. Like, I've got to read all the Russians this summer, but I also felt like there's a new book out and I haven't picked it up. I've got to read that. And I think I feel less pressure on both ends now. I think I realized at some point that I was as well read as a PhD in many ways, and whatever holes I had in my reading everyone has holes in their reading. And I also don't need to keep up with every new book that comes out. It's not a trade show. I don't have to know how the latest electronics work. So I think I'm a little pickier now, and it takes me a little while to get to books. I had never read Wolf Hall. Sometimes for me, books can be like restaurants. If they look too crowded, I move on to the next one.
Mm-hmm.
So I waited until just a few months ago to read Wolf Hall and thought, oh, it's so brilliant. It's so encompassing. Yeah.
And the next two are just as good. That's the thing.
I know I've got them to look forward to.
Mm-hmm.
Once I stop checking political polls.
Another thing I read, you said you should always write what you know.
Oh, I didn't say that.
No.
No, I say the opposite. You should know what you write, which is why I throw myself into research. I'll deny that. I wrote an entire book about Italy, having only been there for about 10 days. And I feel like it was one of my great skills as a journalist is I can research and immerse myself in anything. So no, I think it's too limiting to write only what you know. But I do think you need to know what you write, and I think research is a thrilling place to throw yourself as a writer.
That's great. That's a great kind of twist on that adage that you hear so often. All right, and then I have just a few questions that you can give us your short answers. Are there any words or phrases that you most overuse?
Wow.
For
I'm sure there are. I'm not sure what they are. Someone else will probably tell me. But yeah, let me think if I can think of any. I often have characters sigh. I usually have to have a draft where I take sighs out.
That's a good one to know about. What talent would you most like to have?
Oh, I wish I could sing. My family's really musical, and my son, who is who's studying both engineering and music, one time I sang, and he looked at me and said, "Can you not hear that?" It's crushed me. I love music, and to know that you can't sing is just heartbreaking.
I know, and we always want the talent somebody else has, and they probably would. They're probably singers. They could write like you.
I have to say I'm happy with my jump shot, so I would not trade my basketball ability for singing, but almost anything else I would.
Well, that's pretty good. What is your most treasured possession?
Wow, my most treasured possession. Family, of course, but I'm going to skip that and go to an actual object. Being a book person and being a Kurt Vonnegut fan, when I was a young writer, I posed as a writer from Esquire to get a chance to interview him when he came to my hometown to speak at a college, and he clearly knew I was not working for Esquire. But at the end, he said, "Well, I look forward to reading it." I was like 18, and I looked like I was 10. No, I think I was 20, but I looked very young. And 15 years after that fake interview, I actually wrote a piece about him and about that fake interview. And he sent a copy of one of his books, a leather-bound copy of The Sirens of Titan. On the inside, he wrote, "To my fellow novelist, Jess Walter, this is the one book of mine that wrote itself. All the others refused. Your friend, Kurt Vonnegut." And for a book collector and for someone whose daydream of being a writer started by crouching in my middle school library and seeing that my books would go right next to Vonnegut and taking one home, it was like having your daydream come all the way around. So of all the books I own, that's easily the most precious.
Oh, what a great story that is, too.
Thanks.
Who is your hero of fiction?
Oh, there are so many. They change all the time. Right now, it's Alice Munro. I'm on a big Alice Munro kick, and my next book will be a book of short stories. And so I actually find myself reading story collections when I'm trying to put a book of stories together, and I just marvel at the way in which these stories go places I could never have imagined. And so right now, those writers who do something you can't imagine being able to do, and for me, it's her right now.
And let's see, what would you consider your greatest achievement?
My greatest achievement? Wow, these are really tough questions, and they
questionnaire. You know, Proust invented this parlor game. They
strain the fake humility that I I try to go through life with. You know, honestly, like publishing a book. I mean, I didn't know any authors. We didn't come from a big reading family. I don't have an MFA. I think my bachelor's degree is suspect. I started working in a newspaper when I was 19. So to have published the books I have is really amazing and humbling.
That's a big accomplishment.
Yeah, thanks. I think so. Some days it's a terror, but most days it's good.
All right, I'm just going to ask you two more.
Okay.
Which historical figure do you most identify with?
Which historical figure do I most identify with? Wow, that's difficult. I'm not sure I can think of one off the top of my head. And how?
Pass if you want.
What's that?
You can give it a pass if you want.
Yeah, I'll come back to that.
All right. And then, do you have a motto?
Do I have a motto?
No, when you're right.
Right. You know, I used to tell my kids before they left the house, be bold. So I guess it would be that. I would just say, you know, whatever, when they went to school, I'd say, be bold. And they always laugh at me. But I suppose it would be that. And historical figures, I'm going to say Tolstoy, historical literary figure.
That's great. Any other questions I didn't ask you that you want?
Oh, I feel like I've been vetted for the vice presidency or something.
It is just a wonderful book. I saw that there are articles today in the Los Angeles Times and the New York Times about the book. I'm sure there's a lot more coming up. Kirkus Reviews actually had a great kind of summary. I loved the way they summed up what the story's about. What they wrote was irresistible hobo brothers, an evil tycoon, a pregnant union organizer, a burlesque star, and a shady private eye light up a tale of the great Northwest in the early 20th century. The fact that the same author has written books is wildly different and all as transporting as The Zero, The Financial Lives of the Poets, Beautiful Ruins, and now this latest tour de force is testimony to Walter's protean storytelling power and astounding ability to set a scene, any scene. We have heard that Jess Walters writes nonstop, 7 days a week, 365 days a year. Please never stop.
And I was thinking of taking a day off until that review, and the pressure of it now.
now we need to tell Kirkus they're wrong.
Yeah. Thank you so much, Stephanie.
Well,
feel like we need to add Sarah's last comment. Just one more here.
oh yes, Sarah McCoy. Yeah.
Oh, that's great. Wow, you've read fast, Sarah. Thank you. Yeah, watching. I think spending all that time looking at the incredible facial hair of 1909 made me think that we are, another one of the echoes of the time. It was like I was in an artisanal pork chop shop in Brooklyn or something, looking at all this great hair and the brushed mustache of the police chief parting for Ursula the Great to come out. Thank you.
Mm-hmm. Well, it's a great book, so I hope everyone enjoys it as much as I did. I've been telling everybody I know to go get it, and One More Page ships all over the country, so you can order it from One More Page and get it anywhere, and it is great prose. I mean, you just can't put it down, so it's fun, fast read.
Thanks so much.
Well, thank you. I really enjoyed this. It's just been great to hear more about your whole process and all that went into this book, because it's such an unusual and really transporting book.
Well, I'm going to come back and grill you. You need to be on the hot seat next time.
I hope it wasn't too much of a hot seat.
No, it was great. No, yeah, it's funny how a question like your favorite historical figure will freeze you. Can I say Hamilton? No, that's not right.
And you'll be thinking about it again tomorrow.
I will. I'll sit up in bed. Yeah. Yeah, exactly. Thank you.
Well, I appreciate both of you taking the time tonight. It's been a wonderful, wonderful conversation and a wonderful book. I hope more people get it. And we can't wait to see what's next.
Yes.
Yeah, thanks, everyone.
Yeah, lots of luck with it.
Take care.
Thank you. Good night.
Good night.